The road to Thornhill Manor was long, winding, and shrouded in mist. Thick, ancient trees lined the path, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The faint light of the setting sun barely penetrated the dense fog, casting an eerie glow over the desolate countryside. Ellie and Mark Harper, weary from hours of driving, exchanged uneasy glances as their car struggled up the gravel drive. "I'm sure it'll be fine," Mark said, though the unease in his voice betrayed him. "It's just a bed and breakfast, a place to rest, that's all." Ellie nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the darkened silhouette of the house ahead. Thornhill Manor loomed large in the distance, its tall, narrow windows like hollow eyes staring out at them. The closer they got, the more the old house seemed to swallow the light, its slate roof and weathered stone walls blending seamlessly into the fog. When they finally reached the front of the manor, Mark parked the car and they both hesitated. The house stood silent, its wooden porch creaking under the weight of the damp air. A single lantern flickered beside the heavy front door, its flame sputtering as if fighting against the thickening gloom. "This place is quaint," Ellie said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She forced a smile, but the feeling of unease had only grown stronger. Mark chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Just think, in 100 years, people will call it charming." They stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. As they approached the door, it swung open with a low, ominous creak. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the dim light inside. She was tall and thin, with sharp features softened only by the wisps of gray hair that escaped from her tightly wound bun. Her dark eyes were keen and unwavering, studying the newcomers with an intensity that made Ellie's skin crawl. "Welcome to Thornhill Manor," the woman said, her voice smooth and measured. "I am Mrs. Thornhill. Please come in out of the cold." Ellie and Mark exchanged another glance before stepping inside. The interior of the manor was as somber as the exterior, with dark wood paneling, heavy drapes, and antique furniture that seemed as old as the house itself. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something else, something faint but unmistakable, a trace of damp earth and decay. "This place is incredible," Mark said, though his enthusiasm seemed forced. "You can really feel the history here." Mrs. Thornhill's lips curved into a tight, almost imperceptible smile. "Indeed, Thornhill Manor has a long and storied past, much of it unwritten." Ellie shivered despite the warmth of the roaring fire in the hearth. "How long has it been a bed and breakfast?" "Only in recent years," Mrs. Thornhill replied, leading them down a narrow hallway lined with faded portraits. "Before that, it was a private residence for many generations. My family has lived here since the early 1800s. They reached a staircase that wound up into the shadows. As they ascended, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, echoing through the quiet house like distant footsteps. At the top of the stairs, Mrs. Thornhill led them to a door at the far end of the corridor. "This will be your room," she said, pushing the door open to reveal a spacious chamber with high ceilings and a large canopy bed draped in heavy velvet curtains. An ornate mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed, its glass clouded with age. "I trust you'll find it comfortable." Ellie stepped inside, her eyes drawn to the mirror. She could have sworn she saw something move within its depths, a flicker of motion just behind her reflection. She turned quickly, but the room was empty except for her and Mark. "It's perfect," Mark said, setting their bags down. "Thank you, Mrs. Thornhill." Mrs. Thornhill nodded, but lingered in the doorway. "Should you need anything, my room is just down the hall. And one more thing," she added, her voice dropping to a low murmur. "Some of our guests have mentioned hearing things at night. The house is old, you see. It has its quirks." "What kind of things?" Ellie asked, her heart beginning to race. Mrs. Thornhill's smile returned, colder this time. "Nothing to worry about. Just the wind, I'm sure. Good night, Mr. and Mrs. Harper." She closed the door behind her, leaving Ellie and Mark alone in the dimly lit room. The silence that followed was thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant sound of the wind howling outside. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, the old wood groaning under her weight. "I don't like this place," she whispered. Mark sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "It's just for one night. We'll be gone in the morning." But as they settled in for the night, the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, the air colder. And somewhere in the depths of the house, far beyond the walls of their room, a door creaked open on its own. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Ellie awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest, the darkness of the room pressing in around her like a suffocating shroud. For a moment she was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings disconcerting in the absence of light. It took a few seconds for her to remember where she was, Thornhill Manor, the bed and breakfast they had found after a long day of driving. Beside her, Mark slept soundly, his breathing deep and even. She listened to the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, trying to calm her nerves, but something else tugged at her awareness, something faint but insistent. A sound, a whisper. Ellie strained to hear, her ears pricking up at the faint murmur that seemed to drift through the walls. It was barely audible, a low, continuous drone that could have been mistaken for the wind if not for the unmistakable cadence of speech. The words were too muffled to make out, but the tone was clear, urgent, insistent. She held her breath, listening intently, but as she focused on the sound, it faded, dissolving into the creaking of the old house and the soft rustle of the wind outside. Ellie let out a slow breath, chiding herself for being so jumpy. It was an old house after all. Old houses made noises. But then she heard it again. This time, it was closer, clearer. It was a voice, a woman's voice, soft and pleading. Ellie's blood ran cold as she sat up in bed, her eyes scanning the dark room. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere nearby, just beyond the walls. She glanced at Mark, who remained undisturbed, and then slowly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him. Her feet touched the cold wooden floor, sending a shiver up her spine. She moved toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The voice was growing louder now, more distinct, and with it came a sense of urgency that she couldn't ignore. It was as if the voice was calling out to her, drawing her closer. Ellie hesitated with her hand on the doorknob, torn between the instinct to flee and the strange compulsion to follow the voice. After a moment's indecision, she opened the door just wide enough to peer into the dark hallway beyond. It was empty. The only light came from a dim wall sconce at the far end of the corridor, casting long, flickering shadows. The air was thick and still, but the voice was clearer now, unmistakable. "Please, help me." The words were faint, but unmistakable, tinged with desperation. Ellie's pulse quickened as she stepped into the hallway, her bare feet barely making a sound on the cold wooden floor. The voice seemed to be coming from the direction of the stairs, down the hall where the shadows deepened into an inky blackness. As she approached the top of the staircase, the voice suddenly stopped. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The silence that followed was almost more unnerving than the whispering. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. And then, from the darkness at the bottom of the stairs, she heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but the soft creak of a floorboard, like someone shifting their weight in the shadows. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned over the banister, trying to peer into the gloom below. She squinted, her eyes straining to make out any shape, any movement in the darkness. But all she could see was the faint outline of the front door, slightly ajar, the flickering light from the lantern outside, casting a weak glow on the threshold. A wave of cold fear washed over her. Had someone come into the house? Or worse, had something let itself in? She was about to turn back, to retreat to the safety of her room, when she heard another sound, this time behind her. A low, mournful moan that seemed to echo through the walls themselves, vibrating through the very wood beneath her feet. It was a sound that spoke of pain, of loss, and it was coming from the locked room down the hall. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she turned, her eyes wide with fear. The door to the locked room was closed, just as it had been earlier, but something was different now. The air around it seemed to shimmer, as though it was pulsing with a life of its own. She backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the door, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the other side. Suddenly, the door rattled in its frame, the handle twisting violently as if someone or something was trying to get out. Ellie gasped, stumbling backward, her hands fumbling for the banister to steady herself. The door shuddered again, and for a moment, she thought it might burst open. But then, just as quickly as it had started, the rattling stopped. The house fell silent once more, the only sound the rapid beating of Ellie's heart. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her body trembling with fear. Then, from the other end of the hallway, she heard Mark's voice, groggy with sleep. "Ellie, what are you doing out here?" His voice shattered the oppressive silence, and Ellie felt a wave of relief wash over her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway of their room, rubbing his eyes. I heard something," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Voices. And that door." Mark frowned, glancing down the hall toward the locked room. "You must have been dreaming," he said, though his voice was tinged with concern. "Come on, let's go back to bed." Ellie hesitated, casting one last glance at the door before nodding. She let Mark lead her back to their room, her mind racing with what she had just experienced. But as she climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to her chin, the feeling of unease remained, gnawing at the edges of her consciousness. She lay there in the darkness, listening to Mark's breathing as he drifted back to sleep, but her own mind refused to quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside seemed amplified, like the house was whispering its secrets to her. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and Ellie slipped into a fitful sleep. But even in her dreams, the voice followed her, whispering from the shadows, pleading for help. And somewhere in the depths of the house, the locked room waited, its door rattling softly in the darkness, as if something inside was growing more restless by the minute. The morning brought little comfort. Pale sunlight filtered through the heavy curtains, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. Ellie awoke feeling more exhausted than when she had gone to bed. The unsettling events of the night before lingered in her mind, and as she sat up, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Mark was already up, standing by the window and staring out into the fog-covered garden. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, turning to look at her with concern. "Not really," Ellie admitted. "I couldn't stop thinking about what happened last night." Mark sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It was probably just a bad dream. This place is so old, it's no wonder you heard strange noises. Houses like this are full of creaks and groans." Ellie nodded, but the explanation didn't satisfy her. The whispers, the rattling door, those hadn't felt like the products of a restless mind. They had felt real, tangible, and the memory of them sent a shiver down her spine. "We should check it out," Ellie said suddenly, surprising even herself with her determination. "Check what out?" Mark asked, raising an eyebrow. "The locked room, the one Mrs. Thornhill warned us not to enter. I know it sounds crazy, but I can't shake the feeling that something is in there, something that needs to be found." Mark hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. "Ellie, we don't even know what's in that room. It could just be a storage closet or a room full of old furniture. Do we really want to go snooping around?" "Yes," Ellie said firmly. "I have to know, Mark. I can't stay here another night without knowing what's behind that door." Mark sighed again, but eventually nodded. "All right. If it'll help put your mind at ease, we'll take a look. But if we get caught, we'll have to apologize to Mrs. Thornhill. We don't want to offend her." Ellie agreed, though the thought of facing Mrs. Thornhill again made her uneasy. There was something about the woman's intense gaze, the way she seemed to know more than she was letting on, that made Ellie wary. But the pull of the locked room was stronger, and she couldn't ignore it. They dressed quickly and left their room, moving quietly down the hall to avoid drawing attention. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the faint ticking of an unseen clock. When they reached the door to the locked room, Ellie's heart began to race. "Let's just take a quick look and get out," Mark whispered as he knelt to examine the lock. "It's an old house, so maybe the lock is easy to pick." He pulled out a small pocket knife and began to work at the lock, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ellie stood behind him, glancing nervously down the hallway. She half expected Mrs. Thornhill to appear at any moment, her stern face disapproving, but the corridor remained empty. After a few tense moments, Mark grinned as the lock clicked open. He stood up and slowly pushed the door inward. The hinges groaned in protest, and a rush of cold air swept out, carrying with it the scent of dust and something else, something faintly metallic, like old blood. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she peered into the room. It was dark, the curtains drawn tight, allowing only slivers of light to penetrate the gloom. Mark reached for a switch and flicked it on, but the overhead light barely flickered to life, casting a weak, yellowish glow that only deepened the shadows. The room was large and sparsely furnished, with an antique writing desk, a wardrobe, and a single unmade bed pushed against the far wall. Dust hung in the air, sparkling in the weak light, and the room felt thick with age, as if it had been untouched for decades. But what immediately drew their attention was the large mirror on the wall opposite the bed. It was massive, its ornate frame gilded and tarnished with age. The glass was cloudy, streaked with grime, but Ellie could still make out their reflections, distorted and faint. "I don't like this," Mark said, his voice tense. "Let's just take a quick look and get out of here." Ellie nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on the mirror. There was something about it that made her skin crawl, something in the way it seemed to draw the light into itself, dimming the room further. She tore her gaze away and began to examine the rest of the room. The wardrobe was empty, its doors hanging slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. The writing desk was covered in a thin layer of dust, but as Ellie brushed it away, she noticed something strange. A series of deep, jagged scratches gouged into the wood, as if someone had clawed at it in a fit of desperation. "Mark, look at this," Ellie called softly, her fingers tracing the marks. "What could have done this?" Mark came over to inspect the scratches, his expression darkening. "It doesn't look like it was done by an animal. These marks, they're too deliberate." Ellie shuddered, pulling her hand away. She moved toward the bed, which was covered in a tattered, moth-eaten blanket. As she lifted it, she uncovered an old, leather-bound book hidden beneath. The cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. "What's that?" Mark asked, peering over her shoulder. Ellie opened the book carefully, the brittle pages threatening to crumble in her hands. The handwriting inside was spidery and difficult to read, but as she squinted at the faded ink, she could make out fragments of sentences, phrases that sent a chill down her spine. "Trapped in this cursed place, no escape. They watch from the mirror. The blood won't wash away." "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Ellie shook her head, flipping through the pages. The entries became more frantic, the writing more erratic, as if the author had been descending into madness. And then, near the end of the book, the entries abruptly stopped, replaced by a single, ominous phrase repeated over and over. "They are coming for me. They are coming for me. They are coming for me." Ellie's hands shook as she closed the book, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a deep, unsettling fear that something terrible had happened in this room, something that had left a stain on the very walls. "Ellie," Mark said suddenly, his voice tense, "look at the mirror." She turned slowly, dreading what she might see. The mirror's surface was shifting, the cloudy glass rippling like water disturbed by a stone. And within its depths, she could see shapes, vague, shadowy figures moving, writhing, as if trapped behind the glass. Ellie gasped, stumbling backward as the figures became clearer, their faces twisted in agony. They pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. And then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished, leaving only the cold, lifeless reflection of the room behind. "We need to get out of here," Mark said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Now!" Ellie didn't argue. She followed him out of the room, her heart racing. The memory of those tormented faces burned into her mind. Mark slammed the door shut behind them, fumbling with the lock until it clicked back into place. They stood in the hallway, breathing hard, the oppressive silence of the house pressing in on them from all sides. Ellie could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the house's dark history bearing down on her. "We're leaving," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't care what happens. We're leaving today." Mark nodded, his face pale. "Agreed. Let's pack our things and get out of here." But as they turned to head back to their room, a low, creaking sound echoed down the hallway. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she looked back at the locked door. It was rattling again. The mood in Thornhill Manor grew increasingly tense as the day wore on. Ellie and Mark tried to go about their morning as if nothing had happened, but the encounter in the locked room hung over them like a dark cloud. They moved quickly, packing their bags in silence, both eager to leave the house and its haunting secrets behind. But just as they were finishing, a knock on their door startled them. Ellie's heart leaped into her throat, but when Mark opened the door, it was just another guest, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile and soft brown eyes. "Hello, I'm Mrs. Thompson," she introduced herself warmly, holding out a hand. "My husband and I arrived late last night. I hope we didn't disturb you." Mark forced a smile as he shook her hand. "Not at all. We didn't hear a thing." Mrs. Thompson glanced around the room and then leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I don't mean to intrude, but have you noticed anything strange about this place?" Ellie exchanged a look with Mark before nodding cautiously. "Yes, actually. We've had some odd experiences." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her expression troubled. "I thought it might just be me. My husband, he's a skeptic, says it's all in my head. But I can't shake the feeling that something is off here." "We were just about to leave," Mark said, his voice low. "Something's not right about this place, and we don't want to stick around to find out what it is." Mrs. Thompson frowned. "Leave? But where would you go? The nearest town is miles away, and the fog is still thick as ever." "We'll manage," Ellie said, trying to sound confident. "It's better than staying here." Before Mrs. Thompson could respond, a loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Ellie's blood ran cold as they all turned toward the door. "What was that?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice trembling. "Stay here," Mark said, grabbing a heavy candlestick from the dresser. "I'll go check it out." "No," Ellie said firmly. "We're not splitting up. We'll go together." Mrs. Thompson hesitated for a moment before nodding, her face pale. The three of them made their way cautiously downstairs, the old floorboards creaking underfoot. The house was eerily silent now, the air thick with tension. When they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found the source of the crash. A large, ornate vase had been knocked over, shattered into countless pieces on the wooden floor. The front door, which had been closed and locked earlier, now stood wide open, allowing the cold, damp fog to creep inside. "Where is everyone?" Mrs. Thompson whispered, glancing around nervously. "There were other guests here last night, weren't there?" "There were," Ellie confirmed, her voice tight. "I saw them at dinner, but now..." The dining room, where they had all gathered the previous evening, was empty, the chairs pushed haphazardly away from the table as if someone had left in a hurry. The kitchen was dark and silent, the lingering smell of last night's meal the only sign that it had been recently used. "Maybe they went outside," Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. He walked over to the open door and peered out into the fog. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" His voice echoed into the thick, swirling mist, but no response came. The fog was so dense that they could barely see a few feet in front of them, the world beyond the doorway shrouded in an impenetrable gray. "This isn't right," Mrs. Thompson murmured, clutching her arms around herself as if to ward off a chill. "People don't just disappear like this." As they stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of the situation, a faint noise reached their ears. A distant, rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps, but too steady, too deliberate. It was coming from the direction of the garden, but as they strained to listen, the sound faded away, swallowed by the fog. "We need to get out of here," Mark said firmly, closing the door against the encroaching mist. "Whatever's going on, we don't want to be here when it gets worse." "I agree," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice quivering. "But what about the others? We can't just leave them." Ellie shook her head, her instincts screaming at her to flee. "We don't even know where they are. We can't stay here, not with that thing in the locked room." Mrs. Thompson looked at Ellie with wide, fearful eyes. "What do you mean, thing?" Ellie hesitated, realizing she hadn't mentioned what they'd found in the locked room. But before she could explain, the sound of footsteps returned, louder this time, echoing from the top of the stairs. They all turned toward the staircase, hearts pounding. "Is someone up there?" Mark called out, his voice cracking with fear. There was no answer. The footsteps continued, growing louder as if someone or something was descending the stairs. The hairs on the back of Ellie's neck stood on end as she stared up at the shadowy figure that was slowly coming into view. It was Mrs. Thornhill. Her face was expressionless, her dark eyes fixed on them as she glided down the stairs, her long black dress rustling softly with each step. There was something unsettling about her movements, too smooth, too deliberate, as if she wasn't walking, but floating just above the floor. "I see you found your way downstairs," Mrs. Thornhill said, her voice cold and detached. "I trust you've been enjoying your stay." "We were just looking for the other guests," Mark stammered, gripping the candlestick tighter. "Where did they go?" Mrs. Thornhill tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "The other guests? I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." "What do you mean?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice trembling. "They were here last night. My husband, the others. Where are they?" A slow, chilling smile spread across Mrs. Thornhill's face. "Perhaps you've simply been seeing things. This house does play tricks on the mind, you know. It's easy to lose track of time and of people." Ellie felt a wave of nausea as she realized the implications of Mrs. Thornhill's words. She glanced at Mark, whose face had gone pale, and then back at Mrs. Thompson, who was trembling with fear. "Are you saying they were never here?" Ellie demanded, her voice shaking. "That we imagined them?" Mrs. Thornhill's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. "Imagination is a powerful thing, my dear. It can make you see what isn't there, and ignore what is." The words hung in the air, thick with menace, and Ellie felt a surge of panic. She grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the door. "We're leaving, now." Mrs. Thornhill didn't move to stop them. She simply stood there, watching with that unnerving smile as Ellie, Mark, and Mrs. Thompson hurried to the door. But just as they reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the lock clicking into place on its own. Ellie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mark tugged on the door, but it wouldn't budge, the handle refusing to turn. "No," Ellie whispered, fear choking her. "No, no, no." Mrs. Thornhill's voice floated through the room, low and mocking. "I'm afraid you can't leave. Not yet." Mark turned on her, his voice desperate. "What do you want from us?" Mrs. Thornhill's expression softened, almost pitying. "It's not what I want, Mr. Harper. It's what they want." As she spoke, a chill filled the air, and the lights flickered, the room dimming as shadows crept across the walls. The faint sound of whispers echoed through the house, growing louder, more insistent. Ellie clutched Mark's arm, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who are they?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Thornhill's gaze shifted to the locked room, her smile fading into a somber expression. "The ones who came before you. The ones who were promised an escape, but instead found themselves trapped here. Forever." Ellie felt the world tilt beneath her, her legs threatening to give out. The reality of their situation crashed over her like a wave, and she realized with dawning horror that they might never leave this house. Mark's hand tightened around the candlestick, his knuckles white. "We'll find a way out. We won't end up like them." Mrs. Thornhill's eyes gleamed with a strange, cold light. "I'm afraid your fates were sealed the moment you stepped through those doors." And with that, the lights flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm, and Ellie could feel the presence of unseen eyes watching, waiting. The sound of footsteps returned, this time from all directions, as if the house itself was coming alive. Panic surged through Ellie as she realized they were surrounded, trapped in a place where the walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolence. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. The room had begun to shift, the floorboards groaning as if something beneath was stirring. The shadows thickened, growing solid, taking on shapes that moved and twisted in the darkness. And then, one by one, the shapes began to step forward, materializing out of the shadows like figures emerging from a nightmare. The missing guests. They were gaunt, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty pits of darkness. Their clothes hung off their skeletal frames, and their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. Mrs. Thompson let out a strangled cry, backing away until she collided with the wall. Ellie and Mark stood frozen in horror as the figures advanced, their whispering voices filling the room with the chorus of despair. "Join us," they murmured, their voices blending into one. "Join us. Stay with us. Forever." Ellie's mind screamed in terror as the figures reached out, their cold, bony hands grasping for her. She tried to pull away, but the house itself seemed to hold her in place, the walls pressing in, trapping her in this nightmare. And in the midst of it all, Mrs. Thornhill watched with a serene, almost sorrowful expression, her eyes reflecting the flickering shadows. "There is no escape," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "Not for any of us." And then, with a final ear-splitting crack, the world went black. When Ellie awoke, she was lying on the cold, hard floor of Thornhill Manor. For a moment, she remained still, her mind struggling to make sense of the darkness that had consumed her. Slowly, she pushed herself up, wincing at the sharp pain in her head. The room was dimly lit now, the fog outside pressing against the windows, casting an eerie, ghostly light into the house. "Mark!" she called out weakly, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Panic seized her as she scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around the room. Mark was gone. So was Mrs. Thompson. The only sound was the faint ticking of the unseen clock and the distant murmur of whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. "Mark!" Ellie cried out again, louder this time, her voice echoing through the empty house. But the silence that followed was deafening. A cold dread settled in her chest as she stumbled toward the door, the events of the previous night crashing over her in disjointed fragments. The faces of the missing guests, twisted in torment. Mrs. Thornhill's chilling words, the darkness that had swallowed them whole. This can't be real, Ellie thought, her mind reeling. It has to be some kind of nightmare. But the cold air, the aching pain in her limbs, and the oppressive weight of the house told her otherwise. This was real. And Mark, wherever he was in danger. She forced herself to move, stepping into the hallway. The shadows seemed thicker now, the air colder, as if the house had grown darker in the absence of light. She could still feel the malevolent presence all around her, watching, waiting for her to make a move. Think, Ellie, she told herself, trying to steady her racing heart. There has to be a way out. There has to be. She had to find Mark. But where could he be? She remembered the way Mrs. Thornhill had looked at the locked room before the darkness had overtaken them, her expression unreadable, almost regretful. Ellie shuddered at the memory, but she knew she had no choice. Whatever answers she sought, they lay within that room. The hallway seemed longer now, the floorboards groaning under her weight as she walked. The walls, covered in dark, peeling wallpaper, seemed to close in on her, the patterns shifting subtly as if the house itself were alive. Ellie's skin prickled with fear, but she forced herself to keep going, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When she reached the locked room, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. The air here was colder, thicker, as if it were imbued with the despair of all those who had been trapped within. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and grasped the handle. It turned easily in her hand. The door creaked open, revealing the same room she and Mark had explored earlier. The writing desk, the wardrobe, the unmade bed, and the large, forbidding mirror on the wall. But something was different. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper, and the room felt wrong, as if it were suspended in a state between past and present. Ellie stepped inside, her eyes immediately drawn to the mirror. Its surface was still cloudy, but now there was something behind the glass, a vague, shifting presence that made her blood run cold. The shapes within were clearer now, almost solid, their forms writhing as if trapped in the glass. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The book was still on the bed, and Ellie snatched it up, her hands shaking as she flipped through the pages again. She needed to find something, anything, that could help her understand what was happening. As she scanned the frantic, spidery handwriting, a page near the back caught her eye. The writing here was different, bolder, as if the author had found a moment of clarity amid the madness. The mirror is the key. It holds their souls, trapped between worlds. They were betrayed, their spirits bound to this place, unable to find peace. The blood. The passage trailed off, the ink smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she reread the words, a terrible realization dawning on her. The mirror. It holds their souls. She looked up at the mirror, the figures within more defined now, their faces twisted in anguish. She could see them clearly, the missing guests, their hands pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. They were the ones who had vanished, trapped in the mirror's cold embrace. And then she saw him, Mark, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He was among them, his hand outstretched, reaching for her. "No," Ellie whispered, her voice breaking. "Mark, no." But the truth was undeniable. Mark had been taken, his soul imprisoned in the mirror, along with the others, bound by the same dark force that had claimed the former owners of Thornhill Manor. The mirror was the key, but it was also the prison. Tears welled up in Ellie's eyes as she reached out to the mirror, her hand trembling. She had to find a way to free him, to free them all. But how? What could she possibly do against a force so powerful, so ancient? She thought back to the diary's final entry, the repeated phrase that had haunted her since she'd read it. "They are coming for me. They are coming for me." Whoever had written those words had known what was coming, had known they were doomed. But they had also left a clue, however cryptic: the blood. Ellie's gaze dropped to the floor, to the deep, jagged scratches in the wood beneath the writing desk. She knelt down, tracing the marks with her fingers, and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Dark stains in the grooves, old and faded, but unmistakable. Blood. She moved to the bed, lifting the tattered blanket. Beneath it, the mattress was stained with more blood, the fabric stiff and brittle. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Whoever had been in this room had died here, violently, their blood seeping into the very fabric of the house. And then it all clicked into place. The mirror wasn't just a portal, it was a conduit, feeding off the life force of those who were sacrificed to it, binding their souls to Thornhill Manor. The former owners, the guests who had disappeared, they had all been consumed by the mirror, their blood sealing the curse that kept them trapped. Ellie's mind raced. If the mirror was a conduit, then perhaps it could be broken. Perhaps there was a way to sever the bond, to free the souls trapped within. But she would need to find the source, the thing that had started it all, the object or ritual that had bound the spirits to the mirror in the first place. As she stood, a memory flashed in her mind. Mrs. Thornhill's cryptic words about the house's history, its unwritten past. There had to be more. Something the diary hadn't revealed. Something that could tell her how to break the curse. She needed to confront Mrs. Thornhill. With renewed determination, Ellie turned and fled the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find the woman before it was too late, before the house claimed more lives. The shadows seemed to press in around her as she raced down the hallway, the air thick with the scent of decay and despair. When she reached the parlor, Mrs. Thornhill was there, standing by the cold fireplace, her back to Ellie. The air was heavy with the oppressive weight of the house's dark history, and Ellie could feel the presence of the spirits all around her, watching, waiting. "Mrs. Thornhill," Ellie called out, her voice sharp with desperation. The woman turned slowly, her expression as calm and composed as ever, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something ancient and weary. "Yes, my dear?" she asked, her voice almost gentle. Ellie didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I know what this house is. I know what the mirror is. You have to help me. There has to be a way to break the curse, to free them." Mrs. Thornhill's gaze softened, her shoulders sagging slightly, as if she carried a great burden. "You've learned much, but the truth, I'm afraid, is more terrible than you know." Ellie took a step closer, her hands clenched into fists. "Please, if there's a way, you have to tell me. I'll do whatever it takes." Mrs. Thornhill sighed, her eyes dark with sorrow. "This house has claimed many lives, their souls bound to it by a curse born of betrayal and blood. The mirror is but a vessel, a means of containing the spirits, but the curse, it is woven into the very foundation of Thornhill Manor." She paused, her gaze distant, as if remembering a time long past. It began with the first Thornhills, who made a pact with forces they could not control. In exchange for wealth and power, they bound themselves to this place, sacrificing the lives of others to maintain the pact. Over the years, the house consumed them, one by one, until only their spirits remained, trapped by the mirror, doomed to repeat their torment for eternity. Ellie's heart sank as she listened. But there has to be a way to end it, to free them. There is only one way, Mrs. Thornhill repeated, her voice tinged with the weight of centuries of sorrow. She turned to fully face Ellie, her expression grave. But it comes at a terrible cost. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer, desperate to understand. Tell me. Whatever it is, I'll do it. I have to save Mark. Mrs. Thornhill's dark eyes bore into Ellie's, and for a moment, it seemed as though the house itself held its breath. To break the curse, Mrs. Thornhill began, her voice low and somber. You must destroy the mirror, but it cannot be shattered by mere force. The bond is too strong, too deeply entwined with the blood of the innocent. To sever the connection, a life must be freely given, sacrificed to the mirror, a life offered in place of all the others. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. You're saying someone has to die to willingly give themselves to the mirror? Mrs. Thornhill nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. Yes. Only by offering a soul of equal purity can the mirror's grip be broken. The sacrifice must be made with full knowledge and intent, knowing that their spirit will be taken in exchange for the freedom of the others. Ellie's mind reeled. The thought of willingly giving her life, or worse, asking someone else to give theirs, was too horrific to contemplate. But as she thought of Mark, trapped in that mirror, his soul slowly consumed by the darkness, she realized she had no choice. If she didn't act, he and the others would remain imprisoned forever. Would it free them all? Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark, the other guests, even the former owners? Mrs. Thornhill nodded. Yes, the curse would be lifted, and their souls would be released from the mirror's hold. But the one who makes the sacrifice, they will be bound to the mirror in their place. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The gravity of the choice before her was almost too much to bear, but she knew she couldn't hesitate. She had come this far, and she couldn't leave Mark to suffer for eternity. She wouldn't. I'll do it, she said, her voice shaking but resolute. I'll offer myself to the mirror. Mrs. Thornhill's expression softened, a flicker of sadness passing over her face. Are you certain? Once the choice is made, there is no turning back. Ellie's heart ached, but she nodded. I'm certain. If it means saving Mark and the others, I'll do it. For the first time, Mrs. Thornhill's cold exterior cracked, and she placed a gentle hand on Ellie's shoulder. You are brave, my dear, braver than any who have come before you. But there is one last thing you must know. The house will not allow you to leave once you've made your choice. It will try to keep you here, to trap you as it has trapped so many others. Ellie's eyes widened. But if I destroy the mirror, the house will collapse and the curse will end, Mrs. Thornhill interrupted. But you must survive long enough to break the mirror. The spirits of this place will not let you go without a fight. They will try to stop you, to claim you before the sacrifice is complete. Ellie swallowed hard, fear clawing at her insides. I understand. Mrs. Thornhill stepped back, her hand falling away. Then go. The night is drawing to a close, and time is running out. Ellie turned and ran from the parlor, her heart pounding as she raced back to the locked room. The hallway seemed to stretch before her, the shadows growing darker, more malevolent, as the house sensed her intent. The walls groaned and shifted, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet, as if the house itself was trying to swallow her whole. But Ellie didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to reach the mirror, had to end this nightmare before it was too late. When she reached the room, she hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. The cold air hit her like a physical force, and she could feel the presence of the spirits all around her, pressing in, watching her every move. The mirror stood in the center of the room, its surface rippling like water, the faces of the trapped souls twisted in silent agony. Mark was there, his eyes pleading with her, his hand pressed against the glass as if reaching for her. "I'm here, Mark," Ellie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm going to save you. I promise." She stepped closer, her reflection merging with the figures in the mirror. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper, as the spirits began to stir. They sensed what was coming, and they were determined to stop it. Ellie gripped the book in her hand, the weight of her decision heavy in her chest. She could feel the house closing in around her, the walls groaning, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the faces within writhing in torment. "This ends now," Ellie said through gritted teeth. She raised the book, ready to strike, but before she could bring it down on the mirror, a force slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. She cried out as the book flew from her hands, skidding across the floor. The shadows in the room thickened, coalescing into a dark, twisted form. A figure made of the very darkness that had plagued the house for centuries. It loomed over Ellie, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Leave now, and your life is spared," the figure hissed, its voice a chorus of whispers. Ellie pushed herself up, shaking with fear, but refusing to back down. "Number, I won't let you keep them trapped here. I won't let you win." The figure surged forward, its shadowy tendrils wrapping around Ellie, constricting her, pulling her toward the mirror. She struggled against the darkness, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought to free herself. "Mark!" she cried out, reaching for him. "Help me!" The faces in the mirror writhed, the spirits trapped within straining against their prison. Mark's face twisted in agony as he pressed harder against the glass, his hand reaching for Ellie's, their fingers nearly touching. And then, with a sudden burst of strength, Ellie tore free from the shadow's grasp. She lunged for the book, grabbing it just as the shadowy figure descended upon her again. With a desperate cry, Ellie swung the book at the mirror with all her might. The glass shattered with an ear-splitting crash, the shards exploding outward in a shower of light and darkness. The shadowy figure let out a terrible, inhuman scream as it dissolved into the air, the spirits within the mirror bursting free in a blinding flash of light. Ellie was thrown back by the force of the explosion, crashing into the wall as the house shuddered around her. The walls groaned, the floor buckled, and the very foundation of Thornhill Manor began to crumble. But she had done it. The mirror was destroyed, the curse broken. As the dust settled, Ellie forced herself to stand, her body aching from the impact. The room was in ruins, the mirror nothing but shattered glass on the floor. The faces of the trapped souls were gone, their torment finally ended. "Mark!" Ellie called out weakly, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, through the dust and the darkness, she saw him. Mark stood among the rubble, his face pale but his eyes clear. He looked at Ellie, and a slow, relieved smile spread across his face. "Ellie," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. Ellie ran to him, throwing her arms around him, tears streaming down her face. "You're free. You're really free." Mark held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. "You did it. You saved us." Ellie pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her heart swelling with joy and relief. "We have to get out of here. The house—" But before she could finish, the house gave a violent shudder, the walls cracking as the floor began to collapse beneath them. "Come on," Mark shouted, grabbing her hand. They ran for the door, the house crumbling around them as they fled. The hallway was collapsing, the ceiling caving in, but they didn't stop. They raced down the stairs, dodging falling debris, the front door in sight. Just as they reached it, the house gave one final, earth-shaking tremor, and the ceiling above them caved in. But they made it through the door just in time, tumbling out onto the lawn as Thornhill Manor collapsed behind them in a roar of dust and splintered wood. The house that had claimed so many lives, that had held so many souls captive, was finally destroyed. Ellie and Mark lay on the grass, gasping for breath, watching as the last remnants of Thornhill Manor crumbled into nothingness. The fog that had surrounded the house for so long began to lift, revealing the pale light of dawn breaking through the trees. "It's over," Mark whispered, pulling Ellie close. "It's finally over." Ellie nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. She had done it. She had saved Mark, saved them all. And now, as the first rays of sunlight touched the ruins of Thornhill Manor, she felt a peace she hadn't known in what felt like an eternity. The spirits were free, the curse broken. And for the first time since they had arrived, Thornhill Manor was silent. They would never return to this place, but as they walked away, hand in hand, Ellie knew that they had left behind a nightmare that would never again awaken. The house was gone, its dark history buried in the ashes. And with it, the ghosts of Thornhill Manor were finally at rest.